They say never meet your idols. When a young horror fan and her brother get stranded in a department store during a brutal snowstorm, they stumble upon a terrifying secret. Will they survive the night, or will their dream meeting become a frozen hell and a nightmare?
What's that? You want to be scared? Come with me. You will experience tales of horror, ghosts, and death. It is not recommended for the weak at heart. Listen in the dark. It's more fun that way. This is Weekly Spooky.
Hello, my spookies. It's Wednesday, and you know what that means. It's time for a little spooky in your weekly. I'm your host and narrator, Enrique Couto, and we have quite the chilling story for you. Here tonight, in my home of Ohio, we had a very surprising snowstorm kinda come out of nowhere. Isn't it funny how even with all the modern conveniences, we still get surprised by Mother Nature? Well, tonight's story is a very big surprise. But before we get to that, I want to say thank you so much for joining me today. And I hope you're subscribed on your favorite podcasting app, because we have a very special bonus show this Friday, an episode of Cutting Deep into Horror where myself and Rachel talk about a very misunderstood and very scary horror film called It Comes at Night. So make sure you're subscribed, and while you're at it, head to weeklyspooky.com/join. For as little as $1 a month, you can support the show directly and get 2 bonus episodes every month. That's weeklyspooky.com/join. I really do appreciate your support. But now there seems to be quite a chill in the air. Snowstorms can be dangerous. The cold, the ice, the way they cut you off from the rest of the world. But sometimes the worst thing about a blizzard isn't what's outside. It's what's trapped inside with you. This story is about 2 kids stuck in a department store during the infamous blizzard of '58, but they weren't alone. You see, sometimes when you idolize someone, you start to think of them as larger than life. But what if they're not even human? So get cozy, my friends, and grab a blanket and a hot cup of cocoa if you have it. We start the story right after this. The Blizzard of '58 by Bruce Haney. Every kid loves a snow day, and Margaret was no exception. But why did it have to be this day of all days? She was upset because her big brother, who annoyingly calls her Margot, was supposed to take her to Meyer and Frank's department store because Lenore Shelley Ghoulcraft was putting on an in-store appearance. Margaret knew that if school got canceled, there was a good chance that the appearance would get canceled as well. Lenore Shelley Ghoulcraft hosted a television show called Miss Ghoul's Hour of Madness on KPWN. The show had only been running for around 3 months, but Margaret had been hooked since the first episode in October of '57. She was impressed by the ad in the paper that had lines like, "We dare you to watch," and "Too scary for the weak-hearted." The first episode was 1951's The Thing from Another World. Margaret loved the show, and her big brother liked it as well. This was a big deal to her because she and her brother used to be close, but he just turned 14 and she was only 12. Not a huge gap, but he was at that age where he was less interested in hanging out with his kid sister and much more interested in impressing the older kids and talking to girls his own age who weren't related to him. Margaret wondered if maybe her brother just liked Miss Ghoul's Hour of Madness because of how beautiful Lenore was. Because she was. Margaret understood that. But she loved her for her humor and for how cool she was. In one episode, Lenore Shelley Ghoulcraft, or as her fans called her, Miss Ghoul, rallied against the local school board for not teaching kids the important parts of history. Kids today don't even learn about werewolves, vampires, or even ghouls like me anymore. Miss Ghoul had rallied. Parents and teachers were not impressed by this, which just made the kids love her that much more. Much to Margaret's dismay, school did indeed get canceled that day. The snow was light, but there was the threat of an even bigger storm, possibly even a blizzard, coming later in the day. But the weather stayed mild, so Margaret started working on her parents to convince them to let her brother David take her to the event anyways. "I've been checking the TV all day, and they haven't said anything about the event being canceled." Margaret's pleas worked, and she got her parents to agree that if it didn't start snowing again by 4 p.m, they could go. The event started at 5 o'clock, but it was only a 20-minute bus ride to the department store where she was having the appearance. So, Margaret agreed to the terms. It didn't snow before they left, but it did start 15 minutes into their bus ride. And by the time they were dropped off in front of the 5-story department store, there was an additional 3 inches of snow on the ground. They arrived after 4:30. David wanted to look at the electronics section first. He heard they had a portable 9-inch television. "I know I can't afford it, but wouldn't it be swell? Your own TV. One you could watch even if our parents are hogging the one in the living room. The cool thing, too, is it weighs less than 20 pounds and has a handle. That makes it portable," David told his little sister. Margaret wasn't having it. "No way! I want a good spot to see Miss Ghoul." She also wanted to get there to make sure it was still happening. When they arrived at the space, there were 30 chairs set up facing the minimal set. No one was sitting in any of them. The stage featured a coffin and a wreath with a sash that said, "Beloved, R.I.P." Just as they got to the front and sat down, a man walked over to the wreath and hung up a handwritten sign with the words, "Event canceled, storm warning," on it. Then, over the PA system, a similar message went out. "Good evening, shoppers. With the impending snowstorm, the in-store appearance of Miss Ghoulcraft is canceled. As well, to be cautious, we are closing the store for the evening. Please bring your final purchases to our always happy, always helpful cashiers. Please do hurry as we want them to get home to their families safely." "But we were so close to meeting her," Margaret pleaded with her brother. "I'm sure they'll reschedule the event. Come on, let's get home while we still can." "Let's look for her. She's probably still here if it just got canceled. We could still meet her," Margaret argued. David wanted to respond and tell her no, but she was already up and moving. Most of the staff were heading towards the exits, so the usually off-limits areas were unguarded. David watched and then followed her. Outside the large windows, David saw that the snow was falling at such a rate he couldn't even see the building next door. It was a total whiteout. "Margot, the snow is really coming down." She didn't listen, so David had to speed up his pace to follow her into the dimly lit hallway she had entered. Okay, Margot, we gotta go while we still can, David said. But just then, Margaret saw a simple sign tacked to the wall that said, Guest, with an arrow pointed further down the dark hallway. She pointed it out to David. We are so close! David got caught up in the moment because he too wanted to meet Lenore Ghoulcraft. He wanted to know if she was even prettier in person than she was on black and white television. They followed that sign to a long walkway that led to another hallway. Who knew there were all these offices behind stores? Margaret asked. They have to count the beans somewhere. The beans? Margaret asked. David didn't answer, and Margaret had lost interest in the answer anyway, because she realized she was standing right in front of the guest door. Margaret knocked, but got no response. So she pushed the door open. Inside, there were red roses with a card next to them, and a small basket of untouched fruit. What wasn't there was any sign of Lenore Ghoulcraft. The handwritten sign on the door said, Sandra Warden, parenthesis, Lenore S. Ghoulcraft. She must have got caught in the snow and never made it here, David explained to his sister. Margaret looked up at him. He could see the disappointment all over her face. Margot, it's fine. I'll take you to the next appearance. Now let's get out of here while we can still get home. And remember, it's Wednesday. We can watch her show tonight, David said, to try to comfort her. What if she's still stuck in the snow and doesn't make it to her show? Margaret asked. Don't worry, there'll be a new episode. They film those things days, if not weeks, before they air, David explained. That made Margaret feel better. That is, until they heard an explosion in the distance, and then the lights went out.
Did you hear that? Better check the locks on your doors. Weekly Spooky will be right back.
They both screamed. Then, a few moments later, they heard what they thought was someone else screaming. It wasn't close, and it was hard to tell where it came from, being that they were in the back room of a 5-story building. I'm scared, Margaret said. It's okay, it was probably just a transformer. The lights went out, right? David explained. What about the scream? Well, we screamed when the lights went out. Maybe it was the same thing with whoever that was. Maybe, Margaret said. Either way, let's start making our way out of here. It's going to be hard in the dark. They struggled because where they were, there were no windows, so it was pitch black. Margaret held out her brother's hand as he led the way. They walked for a few minutes before realizing they may have just went in circles. After a couple more minutes, Margaret thought she was hearing noises, but she couldn't figure out what or where they were coming from. Do you hear that? I don't hear anything, David said. Okay, maybe my mind is just playing tricks on me. It could be rats, David offered. The thought made Margaret let go of her brother's hand so that she could use both of hers to feel the walls as she desperately tried to find a way out. Hold up, David yelled out because she was getting too far ahead of him. But then he heard a click and some light entered the hallway. Margaret had found the exit. Back in the shopping area, they could see a lot better. There were no electric lights, but there was light filling in from the various windows. It was night, but the moon's reflection hitting the white snow that was coming down kept it from being fully dark. This was the moment they realized that there wasn't anyone else in the store. Noticing this, they ran back down the now frozen-in-place escalators, and then ran to the entrance, which was, of course, locked. It didn't take David long to find that you didn't need a key to unlock it from the inside. The only problem was that the doors opened outward, and there were already a couple of feet of snow piled up against them. They both pushed on the doors as hard as they could, but they wouldn't budge. "David, what are we going to do? How are we going to get the doors open?" Margaret asked her big brother. "Margot, maybe it's for the best. I don't think we want to go out there. Look at all that snow. And I don't see anybody. If we go out there, we'll freeze to death." "But I'm already cold," Margaret said. David wasn't quite sure what to do to fix their situation, but he knew he could at least try to solve the problem of his little sister being cold. Of course, this would benefit him too. He was starting to feel the chill as well. The two of them made their way to the home goods section. David found a stack of blankets and covered his sister up. "The smaller the space to heat up, the better we will be at keeping warm. I learned that in Scouts, so stay under the covers until I get back. I'm going to try and find us a tent." With that, he was gone looking for supplies, and Margaret was left alone. She hoped her brother wasn't gone too long. She was still worried about the sounds she had heard earlier. This worry increased when she began hearing the strange sounds again. It didn't sound like rats to her. It wasn't scratching, more like a light tapping. When she realized that the sound was getting closer, she finally figured out what it was. It was footsteps coming from the opposite direction of where her brother had gone. They weren't alone. With her curiosity piqued, she stared in the direction of the approaching figure. The first indication that this person was female was when she saw a leg wearing a black pump come around the corner. Margaret held her breath and remained silent as she waited to see the rest of the body reveal itself. Then, to her amazement and excitement, it turned out to be Lenore Shelley Ghoulcraft in her signature black dress and pumps. "Miss Ghoul!" Margaret yelled. Miss Ghoul just looked towards her with no expression. "I'm your biggest fan," Margaret continued. "Oh, thank you, my dear fiend. Now tell me, what are you doing here all alone in this storm? Shouldn't you be at home in your pajamas with a bowl of popcorn waiting for my show to come on? Tonight, we're playing a personal favorite of mine, The Mad Ghoul from 1943. It's the story of my older brother," Miss Ghoul said, and then laughed. This made Margaret give a little chuckle. In the voice of the Wicked Witch, she asked, "Are you all alone, my pretty? Or is your little dog here too?" Margaret laughed again, but didn't answer. "Are you all alone?" Miss Ghoul asked in her normal voice. "My brother's here. He's trying to find us some supplies to stay warm." Ah, what a good, protective brother. David was searching in the sporting goods department for a tent, but was having no luck. He figured that the small sporting goods section didn't bother carrying tents in the middle of winter. But by this time, he had already found a large bag that he was filling with items that he believed would help them. He told himself that it was not stealing because none of the stuff he was taking was going to leave the building. Being that there were no tents, he needed to find another small space where they could trap their body heat so that they didn't freeze during the night. On the 4th floor, he thought of the perfect spot when he saw the female apparel section. The dressing room. He was nervous as he approached it because it was much darker there, as it was located in the center of that floor, so the light from the windows didn't quite make it. David reached into the bag and pulled out the flashlight he borrowed from the sporting goods section. When he pointed his light into the store, he noticed that a coat rack was lying on the ground, like there had been some kind of struggle. He approached slowly and searched the space with the beam of his flashlight for anything else to be off. "What is that?" David said. He knew what it was, but hoped that he was wrong. He continued moving forward, now at an even slower pace. "Oh, fudge," he whispered to himself as he continued towards the pool of blood he saw on the floor. Fudge, fudge, fudge! He wanted to scream when he saw the dead body of what he thought was a man who looked like he had been attacked by a wild animal, with his neck torn open and his intestines laying next to him, plus the rather large chunk out of his skull. It was hard to determine what was the wound that killed him. The only reason he didn't scream was that he was worried that whatever did this was still in the building. He turned around and ran. He had to get back to his sister before whatever did this got to her.
Don't go away. Weekly Spooky will be right back.
"The doors are stuck. We can't get out," Margaret explained to Miss Gould. "Oh, well, what are we to do?" Miss Gould said. "Aren't you freezing in just that dress?" "Oh, yes, it is quite cold, but I hide it well. I'm just that good of an actress." "But your skin looks so smooth, no goosebumps or anything. It's freezing in here." "It's amazing what modern makeup can hide," Miss Gould laughed. "I guess so," Margaret said. "Margot! Margot!" David yelled as he ran to where he had left his sister. But when he spotted Miss Gould standing there, he stopped in his tracks. "What, David?" Margaret asked. But he paid no attention. His panic was temporarily forgotten as he looked upon Miss Gould, and she smiled at him. It's Lenore Ghoulcraft, in the undead flesh. A pleasure to make your acquaintance, young man," she said. Then she switched from a friendly smile to a seductive one. The teenage boy's hormones were activated, and he completely forgot about his panic from the horrors he had just seen. "Gee whiz, you are even prettier in person." "Oh, am I? You flirt," she said, and then threw her head back in a seductive laugh that grew in intensity until it transformed into something else, something manic. When she put her head back down to look at the boy, she smiled and opened her mouth to reveal her teeth. David smiled back because he didn't know what else to do. The laughter scared Margaret, so she pulled the blankets over her head. Since she was hiding, she didn't see Miss Gould stick out her alarmingly long tongue. David looked at her in shock as she smiled with her large, serpent-like tongue sticking out. He then watched in horror as she curved the tip of her tongue back towards her mouth where she used it to remove her fake front teeth. This revealed her real teeth, which were sharp and looked like they were made for chewing through bone. Because she was hiding, Margaret didn't see what happened when Miss Ghoul attacked her brother. All she heard was his scream, and by the time she got the nerve to climb out from her blankets, they were both gone. And there was a pool of blood where her brother had been standing. Margaret knew she had to hide, but where? Plus, she was too cold to get out from under the blankets. She looked all around at what her options were. None looked great. But then she noticed that duffel bag that David had brought back with supplies was left behind. She didn't get out from under her blankets. She simply scooted herself forward, pulling the blankets with her. When she got close enough, she grabbed the handle of the bag and dragged it towards herself. She unzipped it in a hurry, worried that Miss Ghoul would come back. She started to look inside, but she stopped and listened when she thought she heard something. After waiting 10 seconds, she chalked it up to her nerves and began searching through the bag once again. When she heard footsteps running towards her, she took one look behind her, hoping it was her brother. It wasn't. It was Lenore Shelley Ghoulcraft. She had abandoned her heels and was running right towards her. With her sharp teeth and the blood that was dripping from her mouth, down her chin and onto her dress. Margaret no longer saw her as the hero to look up to. She didn't even see her as a person, more like a creature, like an actual ghoul. Margaret dug through the bag frantically, looking for something to fight her off with, but found nothing. Before Miss Ghoul got to her, she burst out of the blankets with the bag in hand and ran as fast as she could. She was afraid to look back to see how close Miss Ghoul was, so she didn't. She wasn't sure how close Miss Ghoul was as she sprinted from the home goods section and navigated through the kitchen area. If she wasn't in such a panic, she might have thought about grabbing a knife on her way through. But she was so lost in terror that she almost ran straight into a floor display of pots and pans. As she exited the kitchen department, she heard a loud bang, and then things falling to the ground. Miss Ghoul must not have made it past the pots and pans display like she had. If she had seen that in a cartoon, Margaret would have been laughing. But in real life, she knew it would just make Miss Ghoul angry and more determined. She did hope that it would buy her a little time at least. So, when she reached the juniors' clothing department, she decided to hide behind the Sunday dresses that hung against the wall. Margaret sat and tried to catch her breath while listening for any sign of Miss Ghoul. When she was calm enough to remember how cold she was, she dug through the duffel bag again. Lucky for her, her brother had found a warmer coat than the one she had on, a hat, and even a better pair of gloves. The coat was the kind she saw rich kids wear, while the hat was even fancier than that. It was made of fur. It was the kind of hat she only saw people wear in movies. She put it on, and then put the jacket on over her other coat. Though she was still frightened, this bit of comfort and warmth made her smile. However, she only got to enjoy it for a moment. She forgot all about her comfort when she heard footsteps approaching her hiding spot. She put her hands together like she did before she went to bed each night and prayed. She hoped God could still hear her, even though she was not saying her prayer out loud like she normally would. Dear God, please let that be my brother. Please let him be alive. Even though he is annoying, I love him. Also, God, please don't let me get eaten by Miss Ghoul. Amen. But she accidentally said the Amen part out loud. When two hands reached into the dresses to pull them apart, revealing her hiding spot, she screamed.
Don't go away. Weekly Spooky will be right back.
When David heard his sister scream, he knew he had to get out of his hiding spot. It was a good one, too. He found one of the new models of refrigerators, the ones that don't lock from the outside. He knew how to check for the inside latch because it was all over the news 2 years previously when the Refrigerator Safety Act was put into place after several kids locked themselves in discarded fridges while playing hide-and-seek. Those kids always won the game, but when they were finally found, they couldn't celebrate their victory. As he made his way towards the scream through the kitchen department, he grabbed a knife. He wished he had the duffel bag. In there, he had something he really thought would help them fight her off. He had grabbed it and put it in the bag after he had found that first dead body. Miss Ghoul picked up young Margaret with one hand, held her above her head, and laughed. "Oh, you sweet thing, I will so enjoy eating you," she said, exposing her large teeth again. With ungodly strength, she moved Margaret closer to her mouth, which unhinged and opened wider and wider until her mouth was large enough to take Margaret's whole head in. "Hey! Barf breath!" David yelled while running at her with a knife held in front of him. Miss Ghoul looked over at him, then threw Margaret at David. His reaction time wasn't quick enough to move the knife, and his sister landed on it, stomach first. "Margot!" David screamed as they tumbled and rolled onto the floor from the momentum. As the ghoul approached, she pulled the knife out of Margaret and walked over to David. As Miss Ghoul walked away, Margaret rolled up her coat in a panic to look at her wound. It was minor. If she hadn't been wearing the two coats, she might have been dead. "Hey, cutie, I wondered where you'd gotten off to. Did I play too rough last time?" she said, then took the knife and pressed it into David's shoulder. It was the same spot where she had bitten a small chunk out of him earlier. The pain was excruciating, but he still had the wherewithal to yell to his sister. "Margot! Grab the bag! It's in the bag!" Margaret jumped up. She wanted to fight off the ghoul, but she followed her brother's demand and ran to where the bag was hidden. Inside, she pulled out a small camping stove, a small container of kerosene, and another flashlight before she spotted what looked like a gun. But the barrel was too big, she thought. It looked like a shotgun handgun. She searched the bag for bullets, but only found these cylindrical things, which she hoped were them. She slid one in. It fit, then put one more in her pocket. "Here goes nothing," she said, then pointed the thing at Miss Ghoul and pulled the trigger. You have to cock it! Her brother screamed in agony as Miss Gould twisted the blade. Fudge! Margaret cocked the gun, pointed it at Miss Gould, and pulled the trigger. Out of the barrel, a projectile hit Miss Gould on the back and then burst into flames. This made her stop her attack on David as she frantically patted the back of her head, putting out the fire and checking for damage. Once the fire was out, she stood up and walked towards Margaret. A flare gun? That was your big attempt at stopping me? Miss Gould laughed. Margaret was scared but determined. She waited for the right moment. It came when Miss Gould hissed at her. Lucky for Margaret, she opened her mouth wide in the process. That was the moment that Margaret fired the second shot she had loaded. Margaret watched as the flare flew directly into Miss Gould's mouth, slid on her tongue, and disappeared down her throat. Miss Gould bellowed in agony and scratched at her throat as if she could get to the burning flare that was in her esophagus. Margaret took this opportunity to run to her brother and pull the knife out of his shoulder. She slid it into the front pocket of her jacket so that she could have both hands free to help David up. As soon as he grabbed one of her hands and started running, dragging her behind. He pulled so fast that she almost lost her balance. They ran down multiple frozen escalators before Miss Gould once again caught up to them as they ran through the shoe department. Miss Gould was furious and began to take large leaps across the floor towards them. They tried knocking over as many shoes as they could to slow her down, but it did very little. Eventually, they found themselves up against the windows leading to the outside. "Where are we going to go?" Margaret asked. "I don't know," David said. "I'm too young to die." David looked around at what was at their disposal to fight the creature off. "Stay here." What? "Do you trust me?" David asked. "Yes." "Okay," David said, then ran, leaving his sister behind as Miss Gould approached.
Shh, it was only the wind. You're safe. Weekly Spooky will be right back.
When he got far enough away, he yelled, "Hey, you old hag! Come get me!" Miss Gould took the bait and ran towards David, who grabbed the big metal shoe size measurer and then ran towards where the ghoul had been. Then he made his way towards his sister. At this point, he wished they hadn't knocked over all the shoes because it hadn't slowed Miss Gould down much, but it was slowing him down significantly. He got just close enough to his sister when Miss Gould grabbed the back of his shirt. "Duck!" David yelled, and threw the heavy metal shoe measurer towards his sister. She just barely moved in time as it whizzed past her head and smashed the large glass window behind her. The cold was felt instantly by Margaret, and snow began to flow into the department store. "Jump!" David yelled. Margaret looked out the window. They were on the second floor. It was still dumping snow, and she prayed that the snow hadn't frozen over yet. Since it was still coming down, she told herself it must be soft. If it was, it might be survivable. If it's hard, it would be like jumping onto concrete. "Screw it," she said in an attempt to convince herself. But when she went to jump, she couldn't do it. She was too scared. "Jump!" David yelled as Miss Gould turned him around and opened her mouth wide to bite him. "This bite you won't run away from," Miss Gould said. "Let go of my brother!" Margaret yelled as she ran towards Miss Gould. In her hand was the knife she had pulled from her brother's shoulder earlier. She slashed Miss Gould's face, creating a large gash through her mouth and nose. Blood flowed down from her wound at a rate that alarmed Miss Gould. She dropped David so she would have both hands to inspect her sliced open face. "I guess you have more of a face for radio now," Margaret said. David ran to his sister and hugged her. "You saved my life," he said, and then grabbed her by the hand and ran towards the window. He was leaving this all up to Faith as he leapt out, pulling his sister behind. They both disappeared into the heavy snow that was coming down in sheets, hoping for survival. The sounds they made when they hit the ground made Miss Gould smile. There was a thud. Then they both bellowed in agony. But you can't bellow if you're dead. In the fall, Margot broke her right arm, and David twisted his ankle. They writhed in pain as Miss Gould looked down from the broken window, with her now, thanks to Margaret, much larger smile. They both got quiet when they heard someone slogging through the snow in their direction. "Margaret, is that you? David?" a woman's voice said. "It's them! It's really them!" another voice said. Margaret and David were both relieved to see it was their parents. "How did you get here?" Margaret asked. "Originally in a taxi, but it got stuck, and we walked the rest of the way," Mom said. "We were so afraid you were somewhere freezing to death," their father said. "All right, come on, quick, get up. We have to get you somewhere warm." "I don't think I can walk," David said. "I think my arm is broken," Margaret cried. A sound of laughter came from above. Margaret, David, and their parents looked up, but Miss Gould was gone. "Did you jump out of that window?" "Why?" their father asked. "Let's not worry about that now. We need to get them out of this cold." "Doesn't your aunt live around here?" the father asked. "Oh, yes, she does," the mother said. With that, the father picked up David and the mother helped Margaret up, and they made their way to their aunt's to warm up and figure out what the next step would be. That night, the last episode of Miss Gould's Hour of Madness aired. However, with all the power outages around town, almost nobody saw it. Weeks later, after what became known as the Blizzard of '58 had come and gone, the family sat watching television. Margaret's arm was still in a cast, but was healing nicely. On the news, they announced that Miss Gould's House of Madness was no more, and that Lenore Shelley Gouldcraft had not been seen since the snowstorm. "Oh, I'm sorry, dear. Hopefully she's okay," her mother said. Margaret and David shared a glance. "You won't get to meet her now," her mother added. "It's all right, Mama. I don't want to meet her. What if she was awful? It's like people say, never meet your idols." Well, my spookies, I hope you enjoyed one last little bit of wintertime terror before spring has sprung. But you never know, there might be another one down the pike, honestly. For all I know, it's waiting in the wings. A big thank you to Bruce Haney for tonight's wonderful story, and I want to let you spookies know, next week we have a story by Travis Van Hoos. If you haven't heard his stuff before, you're really in for a treat, so make sure you're subscribed. And I want to say a humongous thank you to everybody who's joined us over on Patreon at weeklyspooky.com/join. For as little as $1 a month, you support the show and get 2 bonus episodes every single month. But I want to say an even bigger, even spookier thank you to our Patreon podcast boosters, folks who pay a little bit more to hear their name at the end of the show. And they are Jessica Fuller, Johnny Nix, Jenny Green, Amber Hansford, Brent McCullough, Karen Wiemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. Thank you guys so much for your support. It really does mean the world to me. And if you want to hear your name on the show as well, just head to weeklyspooky.com/join. Our current audiobook series, The April Fool, will soon be resolving, and it's getting bloody, so now's a great time. And choose a contribution at $15 a month or higher. Not only will you hear your name come out of my spooky, silky voice, but you'll get 2 bonus shows every month and 4.5 years of bonus material such as full audiobooks, creepypasta readings, and so much more. So thank you so much, weeklyspooky.com/join. Now, my spookies, it's time for me to get back to work because we have so much more to scare you with, including a new episode of Cutting Deep into Horror on Friday, and of course on the last Monday of the month, Monthly Spooky. So for myself, for my executive producers Rob Fields, Mark Shields, and Bobbletopia.com, my producer Dan Wilder, and my composer Ray Mattis, I will talk at you next time, so stay warned.
Thank you for listening. Make sure to find your way back next week. But for now, you are safe. Trust me.